to the Metal Command Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Metal Command Podcast. Tony here with you, and I'm going to talk about something that really rattled people's cages about a month ago on the Metal Command Facebook page. And I had made a comment that Ronnie James Dio was the better singer for Black Sabbath than Ozzy was, and that I like Ronnie James Dio's voice better than Ozzy's, and that I think Ozzy as a singer is a little bit mediocre compared to what Ronnie James Dio brought to the table as far as their singing voices go. And a lot of people got really angry over this. A clear majority of people agreed with me, but there were a fair share of people who were pretty angry at me for making that statement. So it made me decide, you know what? Let's compare and contrast the careers of both of these singers, as well as, you know, what they brought to the table, not only with Black Sabbath, but with their respective solo careers. And when looking back on it, it's very clear to me, in my opinion, I thought Ronnie James Dio was better for Black Sabbath, but Ozzy Osbourne had a better solo career, in my opinion, and of course was more successful with his solo career. And as singers, strictly talking about their voices, not their accomplishments, Ronnie James Dio is the better singer. So I'm going to dig into all of that with this podcast, and some of you may not like my takes on it, but again, please leave a comment. If you're on YouTube, obviously, leave a comment, like the video if you like the video, and share your thoughts and opinions with me, as well as on the Facebook page. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. So let's start off with them as singers. Strictly talking about their singing voices. I'm not talking about accomplishments. I'm not talking about who had the better career. I'm strictly talking about what they are capable of as a vocalist. And it is very clear, Ronnie James Dio is a much more capable vocalist, and technically, from the technical standpoint, he has a better voice than Ozzy Osbourne. One of the things that pissed people off is when I said Ozzy Osbourne's voice is mediocre compared to Dio's. You know, there's a lot of people's voices who are mediocre compared to Dio, who are probably more accomplished than, you know, Ronnie James Dio is. I mean, James Hetfield is definitely not, you know, as good of a vocalist singing wise as Dio, but obviously Metallica is probably the most successful heavy metal band of all time. So it really wasn't a knock against Ozzy. I'm strictly speaking about their singing voices. And it's very clear Ronnie James Dio has a better and more capable voice than Ozzy Osbourne does. As far as how they fit with Black Sabbath, and originally this post went up because, you know, Sharon Osbourne talked about how, had said something along the lines of like, Dio could not replace Ozzy and Sabbath. And I think that's a load of crap. And I'm going to tell you why. Number one, although the Ozzy Osbourne Black Sabbath material was extremely influential, and I think those albums are all very good. In fact, when it comes to Black Sabbath, aside from the Seventh Star album, there really hasn't been a record. I think Seventh Star and Forbidden, there really hasn't been an album that I have really disliked by them. They've all been pretty good. But Sabbath went from this sort of like doom metal, kind of sound to in my opinion, they became a much better band musically when Dio came into the fold, because Ronnie James Dio is capable of doing more vocally than Ozzy Osbourne is. And, it's interesting because here's the thing. When people got mad at me for saying I think Dio is better in Black Sabbath than Ozzy Osbourne and he was more than capable of replacing him, I pointed two things out. The first thing, in 26 years of doing this show, I have had on a multitude of occasions lots of musicians and singers who say Ronnie James Dio, especially singers, who tell me and have told me Ronnie James Dio had a significant influence on them to either become a singer or had an influence on their singing voice. I cannot name anybody who ever said that about Ozzy. As far as singers go, nobody goes and says Ozzy Osbourne's voice, at least that I know of. Most people don't go and say, hey, Ozzy Osbourne's voice had a significant influence on me. They don't do that. But you hear that all the time about Ronnie James Dio. The second point that I made, while I firmly, in my opinion, I think obviously Ozzy singing his Black Sabbath songs sounds better than Ronnie James Dio singing them. The difference is, and I'll use Live Evil as an example, Ronnie James Dio was more than capable of singing the material that Ozzy Osbourne sang on. But Ozzy Osbourne, there is no way he could pull off the stuff that Dio did in Black Sabbath. Again, Dio being a more capable singer. And this is what made a lot of these Ozzy fans angry. I mean, pissed off and angry at me. But let's face it, let's call it for what it is. Dio can sing the Ozzy stuff live. Ozzy could never sing what Dio did on Heaven and Hell Mob Rules. Another thing that people had said too was, oh, they were garbage when Dio took over and they weren't successful, which is a lie. Heaven and Hell was an album that had gone platinum. Mob Rules went gold. So clearly Black Sabbath was still a very successful band with Dio singing for them. And, I hear just as many people tell me that the Ozzy era Sabbath stuff was influential on them as much as I hear people say Heaven and Hell Mob Rules were very influential on them. So it's about even keel on that. Now, when it comes to the solo careers of both Dio and Ozzy Osbourne, this is where I change my opinion. Granted, Dio may have been, the better singer, but Ozzy had the better solo career. And in my opinion, if you take the entire discography from Ronnie James Dio and the entire discography from Ozzy Osbourne and you compare them, Ozzy was much more consistent than Dio was. And I'm going to explain to you why. So in order to kind of go, let's kind of dissect this a little bit. Let's break this down a little bit. Obviously, album sales. If you go by album sales, Ozzy Osbourne clearly more successful and more accomplished when it comes to album sales. But I'm not really just going by that. I am going by the quality of the albums that both men put out as solo artists, right? Let's compare them. So let's start off with the first two Dio albums and the first two Ozzy Osbourne albums. All four of those records, Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman with Ozzy, and of course Holy Diver and The Last in Line with Dio, are considered heavy metal classics. All four of those records are highly renowned and recognized as four very influential albums, right? The first two Dio albums, of course, they had Vivian Campbell playing guitar, and of course you had Randy Rhoads on the first two Ozzy albums. Now, comparing both of the first two albums by both guys, for me, personally, it's kind of even. I mean, first of all, when you think about the singers, obviously I'm giving the advantage to Dio. But with Ozzy, as much as I love Vivian Campbell and thought, he played some amazing stuff on those first two Dio albums. Ozzy had Randy Rhoads. Randy Rhoads was just a phenomenon back then, and I like Diary of a Madman a little bit more than Blizzard of Oz, but if I had to pick, I really couldn't pick between Holy Diver, Last in Line, Blizzard of Oz, and Diary of a Madman. I mean, the first two albums by both artists, it's pretty even for me. I don't like one or the other any better. It's kind of like I like them better for different reasons, right? So I would say they're pretty evenly matched in that respect. Now, some people may prefer, the Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman to Last in Line and Holy Diver. I get it. But for me personally, as far as quality goes, they're about even. Then we go to the next two albums by both solo artists. So for Dio, the third album would have been Sacred Heart, and the fourth album was Dream Evil. And for Ozzy, you had Bark at the Moon and The Ultimate Sin. And both Bark at the Moon and Ultimate Sin are considered by Ozzy's fan base to be two of his weaker records. I kind of disagree with that. With Dio, Sacred Heart and Dream Evil, people considered them weaker than the first two Dio albums. That's the consensus by most of the fan base, at least from people that I've spoken to over the course of the radio show and, of course, the podcast. And I would tend to agree that the next two subsequent albums by both artists were not as good as the first two albums they put out. And again, if I had to pick, like, if I were to go to Bark at the Moon and Ultimate Sin compared to Sacred Heart and Dream Evil, again, just like the first two albums by both Dio and Ozzy, I'm kind of, it's kind of flip a coin. I like them both about equally. Sacred Heart was the last album that Vivian Campbell played on. I had some great songs on it. Dream Evil, of course, Craig Goldie came into the mix for that record. And then with Ultimate Sin and Bark at the Moon, you had Jake E. Lee come on board with Ozzy. Now, granted, both solo artists, put the third and fourth album out. Their third and fourth albums weren't really, for me, as good as the first two, but they were still very good. And again, I'm kind of even keel on them. I mean, there's some greats. I think The Ultimate Sin is highly underrated by Ozzy. Same with Bark at the Moon. I mean, everybody knows the album Bark at the Moon itself, or the song, but the rest of the album was really good. And I could say the same. I think Sacred Heart by Dio does not get the recognition it deserves. And Dream Evil was a very, very good album. Now, here's where, for me, this is where Ozzy basically his solo career goes far and above what Dio did. And it starts later in their careers. So you had Lock Up the Wolves by Dio. Then you, of course, kind of had that hiatus from his solo career because he rejoined Black Sabbath for the Dehumanizer album. But then you had Strange Highways. And then with Ozzy, you had No Rest for the Wicked, first album that Zakk Wylde plays on. And then, of course, you have No More Tears. Folks, No More Tears, to me, is probably my second favorite Ozzy album behind Diary of a Madman. That album there isn't a bad track on it. The songwriting was phenomenal. You have that one song, Hellraiser, that he did with Lemmy from Motorhead. And the one thing that Ozzy did better than Dio is Ozzy surrounded himself with better musicians than Ronnie James Dio did as a whole. Because you go to Zakk Wylde, and then you're comparing Zakk Wylde to Tracy G. And I don't remember the kid that played on Lock Up the Wolves, but I mean, he was very young. I think he was 18 or 19 years old. But Zakk Wylde, for me, wipes the floor with those guys. And the quality of the songs on No Rest for the Wicked and No More Tears is far beyond what Dio had on Lock Up the Wolves and Strange Highways. Granted, both those Dio albums had some pretty good songs, but for the most part, both of the Ozzy albums, clear and away, I think they're just far better. Then we get to we get further on into the 90s. Osmosis comes out. Now, Osmosis was a letdown for me compared to No More Tears. However, Dio put out perhaps one of the worst albums I've ever heard, called Angry Machines. Angry Machines was a terrible record, folks. I mean, just the songwriting was bad. The guitar playing wasn't great. Dio's voice sounded good, but you could sound great all you want, but if the songs are not good, the album is not going to be good. And again, Ozzy put out a better record in Osmosis than Angry Machines. And I'll never forget this. I did an interview with Dio back when Angry Machines, right after it came out, right on that tour. In fact, I think Dio was they were opening for Iron Maiden with Blaze Bayley. Actually, a Blaze Bayley fronted Iron Maiden was headlining, and then you had Dio Dio recorded a live album in 1990. This is 1998. So I had just started the show, and I'm maybe 19, 20. I'm 20 years old at that point. And I never forget I had Dio come on my show. Now, I used to write for some websites, and he saw the review, the very bad review I wrote on Angry Machines, and he came on my show live and kind of lit me up a little bit. And as a 20-year-old, having a guy like that come on your show, it was something I wasn't expecting, and it was pretty crazy. And there was a time back then, because I was so new at this, I really didn't know how to respond to him, because no artist had ever come on and done that to me. But he called me out for my hate for it and talked about why the songs were what they were. And okay, great. I still don't like the record. And then if you go to like the next 3 Dio albums, you had Magica, Master, you had these the last 3 albums he recorded as a solo artist. I don't think they're anywhere as good as what Ozzy did, in the 2000s. Ozzy had the album Scream with Gus G from Firewind. That album was phenomenal. So really, if you look at it, I think even though Ozzy as a singer is not on the level of Ronnie James Dio, he was more successful. And the reason he was more successful, number one, you had, as a whole, you brought better musicians into your band than what Dio was doing, especially the last half of especially compared to the last half of Dio's solo career. I mean, you had Randy Rhoads, you had Jake E. Lee, you had Zakk Wylde, you had Gus G. I'm speaking of guitar players. I mean, they had phenomenal guitar players. The only guitar player I can think of that was like a game changer for Dio was Vivian Campbell. I mean, Doug Aldrich was okay in that band. I thought Doug Aldrich was better. Doug Aldrich was better in Lion and Whitesnake. But Dio still, as a whole, did not have the same caliber of musicians, as a whole, in my opinion, as Ozzy did. And I love Ozzy's solo career as a whole better than Dio's. Just how it is. I love Dio as a singer much better than Ozzy, and I like his era in Black Sabbath better than Ozzy's by far. Let's call it for what it is. If you go and ask the average metal fan that knows who both Ozzy and Dio are, they're going to tell you that as a whole, they like a lot of Ozzy's solo albums better than Dio's. Again, Dio's best era for his solo career was Holy Diver through Dream Evil. After that, the albums are very spotty, one of which being terrible. I can't remember Ozzy putting out a terrible album as a solo artist. There isn't, like, if I go through his whole discography, I don't look at an album and say, hey, this album sucks, this album's terrible. But I could say that about Angry Machines with Dio. So that's where I stand on the subject. Again, Dio, as a singer, definitely better than Ozzy as far as his technical ability and what he is able to do. I prefer Dio and Sabbath over Ozzy. Not saying the Ozzy Osbourne Black Sabbath stuff is bad, because I love those records, but I like the stuff with Dio much better. However, I like Ozzy's solo career better than Dio's. Even though I love the first 4 Dio albums, I mean, as a whole, Ozzy Osbourne never really put out an absolutely horrible record like Angry Machines. He just never did. So there's my take on it. Comparing Ronnie James Dio to Ozzy Osbourne. Made that comparison, of course, because look, the guys, they've been getting compared to each other for decades, ever since Dio replaced him in Sabbath. And when you see that remark that Sharon Osbourne made about Ozzy, being Dio can't replace Ozzy, I think it's a load of crap. He definitely replaced him. The band definitely was very successful, and they put out 2 of the most influential albums in the history of the metal scene. And again, at the same token, I look at the caliber of musicians Ozzy had in his solo career. In my opinion, much better than what Dio had over the course of his solo career. I mean, like I said, Vivian Campbell was great. I like Randy Rhoads a little bit better. And again, the first 4 Dio albums are timeless. But man, is Ozzy, as overall in his career solo-wise, more successful, and he was more consistent as far as how good his albums were. So with that said, thanks for watching. Stay metal. Leave me your comments. Let me know what you think.